At exactly 6:40 p.m. on April 23, 2025, Moises Mendoza took his final breath in the execution chamber at Huntsville State Penitentiary. But what happened in those final 24 hours? What goes through a killer's mind when death is imminent? And more importantly, what did Moises Mendoza say to the family of the woman he murdered that made them break down in tears? Stay with me, because this story has twists you won't see coming. April 22, 2025, 6:40 p.m. Exactly 24 hours before his scheduled execution, Moises Sandoval Mendoza sits in his death row cell at the Polunsky unit, staring at a clock ticking towards his death. For over 20 years, this moment seemed impossible. But now, it's real. At 41 years old, Mendoza has spent more than half his life on death row. But here's what's chilling, he's not the nervous wreck you'd expect. Prison guards describe him as eerily calm, almost accepting. But why? What happens to a man's mind with less than 24 hours to live? The answer lies in a crime so brutal, so senseless, it haunted a small Texas town for decades. It happened 21 years ago in Farmersville. But before we dive into that nightmare, you need to understand something about death row in Texas most people don't know. Something that would make Mendoza's final hours even more disturbing. Here's what makes Texas different from other states. Condemned inmates don't choose their last meal anymore. That policy changed in 2011 for a shocking reason. Instead, Mendoza ate the same standard prison meal as every other inmate that day. No fanfare. No special requests. Just another reminder his life was no longer his own. But while his body prepared for death, his mind drifted back to March 17, 2004. The night that changed everything. It was around 10 p.m. when 20-year-old Rochelle O'Neill Tollison returned home to her small house in Farmersville, Texas. She'd spent the evening at her mother's house with her 5-month-old daughter, Avery. Everything seemed normal. Rochelle was going through a difficult divorce, but she was young, determined, and building a new life for herself and her baby. She had no idea that someone from her past was watching, someone who couldn't accept rejection. What happened next would turn a routine evening into a nightmare that took 21 years to resolve. But the terrifying part? It almost went unsolved entirely. March 18, 2004. Morning. Rochelle's mother arrives for her usual visit. She knocks. No answer. She tries the door. It's unlocked. Stepping inside, she immediately knows something is horribly wrong. The back door is wide open. Furniture is scattered. The bed shoved out of place. And there, on the kitchen floor, a muddy boot print smeared across Rochelle's divorce papers. But the most heart-wrenching discovery? Baby Avery, alone and crying on an overturned mattress. Her mother is nowhere to be found. Within hours, a massive search begins. Volunteers on foot, horseback, and ATVs comb the area. The Texas Rangers join the hunt. Days pass with no trace of Rochelle. Then, 5 days later, a hiker makes a discovery that would change everything. 10 miles outside of town, in a remote field, he finds evidence of a recent fire. Burned ground, a makeshift fire pit, and beneath a pile of logs, the charred remains of Rochelle Tollison. But here's where this case takes an incredible turn. The killer thought he destroyed all the evidence. He was wrong. And the clue that would lead police to him? It was something no one had ever used to solve a murder case before. Back in 2004, forensic science was advancing rapidly. But even the most experienced investigators had never seen anything like this. The killer had tried to erase every trace of evidence. No fingerprints, no weapon, no DNA, nothing, except for the logs used to burn Rochelle's body. Investigators collected 8 pieces of wood from the crime scene. Under microscopic analysis, they found something extraordinary, unique metal deposits and unusual levels of titanium. These weren't just any logs. They came from a very specific source. That same night, March 17th, there had been a bonfire at a party in Farmersville. Police tested logs from that bonfire and found 3 pieces with identical metal signatures to the ones at the murder scene. This was a first in forensic science, using burned wood as evidence to solve a murder. And it worked. It pointed investigators directly to the person who had brought those logs to the bonfire. Moises Mendoza. At first, suspicion had fallen on Rochelle's estranged husband, Andrew. He had motive, a messy divorce. But witnesses confirmed his alibi. He'd been at the party all night, drinking heavily. The logs? He hadn't brought them. Mendoza had. But when police questioned Mendoza, His story was so bizarre, so unbelievable. It almost seemed like he was trying to get caught. What he told them would reveal the mind of a killer who thought he was smarter than everyone else. April 23rd, 2025, 12 p.m., 6 hours and 40 minutes until execution. As Mendoza sits in his holding cell, he's probably remembering the moment his lies finally collapsed. Faced with the evidence, he tried to spin a tale. Rochelle left with him willingly. She'd abandoned her baby, her home, her life, to run away with him. No one believed it. Under pressure, the truth finally came out. Mendoza admitted he'd been at the bonfire, talking to Rochelle. She'd rejected his advances. He couldn't accept it. Later that night, he went to her house. He forced his way in, choked her until she was unconscious, then carried her to his truck. He drove her to a field behind his house where he sexually assaulted her, then strangled her twice to ensure she was dead. But it didn't end there. In a panic, he stabbed her in the throat. Then he left her body in the field, thinking that was the end. But fear got the better of him. He returned, doused her body with gasoline, and set it on fire. Then he buried the remains in a remote location, convinced no one would ever find her. He was wrong. The evidence against Mendoza was overwhelming. But what police discovered at his house would remove any doubt about his guilt. And it would reveal something even more disturbing about the man who was about to die. 3 p.m., 3 hours and 40 minutes until execution. By now, Mendoza knows his final appeal to the Supreme Court has been denied. There will be no last-minute reprieve. Death is coming. But as he sits in his cell, he's probably thinking about the moment investigators searched his house. The moment his carefully constructed lies fell apart completely. Police found boots in his closet, boots covered in soot and reeking of gasoline. The tread pattern matched the muddy boot print on Rochelle's divorce papers. They found jeans soaked in ash, with DNA evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. But perhaps most damning of all, they discovered Mendoza had been out on bail for attempting to abduct multiple women in Dallas. This wasn't his first time. Rochelle was just the victim who couldn't get away. The trial wasn't about guilt, it was about punishment. The jury had to answer two questions. Was Mendoza a future danger to society? And were there any reasons to spare his life? The answers were swift, yes and no. Now, after more than 20 years on death row, Mendoza faces the ultimate consequence. But what he's about to say to Rochelle's family will shock everyone in that execution chamber. 6 p.m., 40 minutes until execution. Mendoza is moved to the death chamber at Huntsville State Penitentiary. He's strapped to a gurney, for lines inserted into his arms. In one window, Rochelle's family watches through glass, her father Mark, her mother Pam, and other relatives who have waited 21 years for this moment. In another window, Mendoza's own family sits in tears, his wife, his sister, his friends. A spiritual advisor approaches and prays with Mendoza for 2 minutes. Then comes the moment for final words. What happens next catches everyone off guard. Mendoza doesn't offer generic apologies or religious platitudes. Instead, he turns toward the window where Rochelle's family is watching and addresses each of them by name. He continues, speaking directly to her parents, her brothers, her uncle, her cousin. Personal, specific apologies to each family member. Then he thanks them for being there to witness his death. He turns to his own family and speaks in Spanish. At 6:21 p.m., the lethal drugs begin flowing. What happens next will close the book on one of the most haunting cases in Texas criminal history. At 6:21 p.m., the execution begins. Mendoza lets out 2 gasps, then begins snoring. About 10 snores later, his body goes still. At 6:40 p.m., he is pronounced dead. After 21 years, 1 month, and 6 days, justice has finally been served for Rochelle O'Neal Tollison. Rochelle's daughter Avery, now 21 years old, wasn't present for the execution. But she's grown up knowing her mother's killer finally faced the ultimate consequence for his actions. The case that began with a muddy boot print and ended with groundbreaking forensic science has finally closed. A young mother's life was cut short, a family forever changed, and a community learned that even the most carefully planned crimes can't escape justice forever. Moises Mendoza thought he could get away with murder. He spent over 2 decades on death row learning just how wrong he was. Justice may have been delayed, but it was never denied. If this case showed you anything, it's that justice never stops pursuing the truth. No matter how much time passes, no matter how well a killer thinks they've covered their tracks, the evidence always tells a story. What did you think of Mendoza's final words? Were they genuine remorse, or just an attempt to ease his conscience before death? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more true crime cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the truth is always stranger than fiction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.